My name is Adrienne Smith, and I'm the curator of the Gatehouse Museum. Tonight, we're here in Sykesville, Maryland's historic townhouse building to discuss the topic of mental health care in the Civil War. Before we begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the Community Media Center, who is filming tonight's presentation. The recording of this program will be available directly following tonight's conclusion. The history of mental health care is one in which the town of Sykesville plays a large part. In many ways, the 1896 creation of Springfield Hospital, Maryland's second public institution for individuals with mental health care needs, helped establish the permanency of the town of Sykesville, which incorporated in 1904. Prior to Springfield Hospital, individuals who required state assistance with mental health or substance abuse could be seen at Spring Grove Hospital, originally located in Baltimore and relocated to Catonsville in 1854, where it operates today. More locally, the 1837 establishment of Carroll County required the construction of a county almshouse as a public building. From 1853 until 1965, the Carroll County Poor Farm, which operates today as the Carroll County Farm Museum, served this role, often serving as a place of shelter and basic care for those in the county with mental health care needs. Effective medicinal intervention for mental illnesses did not appear until the mid-20th century. So what did care look like before then? The Gatehouse Museum promotes the curiosity of visitors and residents of the Sykesville area through its collections, displays, and educational programs. Today, we're joined by John Lustria, Educational Director of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, who will enlighten us as to the state of mental health care near the formation of Carroll County's earliest public sources of these services. For more information on the histories of mental health care, Springfield Hospital, and the town of Sykesville, please visit the Gatehouse Museum in person or at our website, www.thegatehousemuseum.com. Without further ado, join us in welcoming John Lustria.
Thank you, everyone. It's thrilled to be with you all here tonight. My first time in Sykesville has been a delightful day. I visited the museum earlier and have enjoyed my time going around the downtown, so it's a thrill to be here with you all today. We will take questions at the end, so those of you that are eager to ask questions, hold on to those for the end of the program. I want to get started before we jump in here by explaining a little bit about who we are, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, that is. We're located over in Frederick, Maryland, just a short drive away. That's our primary location. We are one organization who operates three distinct museums. So the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, 2 floors, 8,000 square feet of exhibit space, telling the story of Civil War medical care and the ways that it impacts us all today, from modern ambulance systems and modern emergency medicine and well beyond that. Additionally, we operate the Pry House Field Hospital Museum, which is located on Antietam National Battlefield, sort of where the rubber meets the road of Civil War medicine. That's an example of a barn that was used as an actual field hospital on the bloodiest single day in American history. It's also the location of the Union headquarters at the battle, and where the Union medical director, Jonathan Letterman, had his medical headquarters as well. And then finally, we have the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum, located in downtown Washington, D.C. We're located right around the corner from Capital One Arena. That's where Clara Barton lived and worked during and immediately after the Civil War. And it's while she lived there that she grew to become one of the most famous humanitarians in the entire world, for that matter, and where she led the search for missing soldiers, which I'll touch on in the program here in just a little bit. Unfortunately, the Missing Soldiers Office Museum, since we're between site managers at the present moment, we're only open for groups of 10 or more. So get 9 of your closest friends and come out and pay us a visit. And you can see more information about our hours and all that good stuff on our website, civilwarmed.org. And then lastly, before we jump in, of course, thank you for being here or tuning in if you're watching this after the fact. And please support not just our museums, but of course the Sykesville Gatehouse Museum. Donate, become a member, and all that sort of thing. That's a great, important way that supports nonprofit organizations like ours. So thanks for being here. That's a lot. So to get started with, I'm going to take us through kind of 3 phases of the program, sort of the state of mental health before the Civil War, during the Civil War and after the Civil War. So before the Civil War, conditions were fairly poor for those who suffered from mental illness. Many were essentially permanent residents at almshouses or poorhouses across the country. But that starts to change thanks to this woman, Dorothea Dix. She was a New England reformer who had spent some time in Europe, and when she returned to the United States, one of her ambitions and goals was to improve conditions for the mentally ill around the country, beginning with the state of Massachusetts, where she lived. She took a survey going through the entire state, taking stock of what was offered, what services there were in 1843. And her statewide survey of the system that existed revealed unregulated and underfunded institutions where frequent infractions occurred. She discovered, quote, insane persons confined within this commonwealth in cages, stalls, and pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. And this is a report that she delivered to the Massachusetts state legislature. So pretty damning findings in this report. And the end result of her efforts was the opening of a state-sponsored mental hospital in Massachusetts. And she goes on to do very similar surveys in not just Massachusetts, but New Jersey, North Carolina, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and more. Other than Dorothea Dix's work, the outlook for mentally ill people is pretty bleak in the United States, unfortunately. And so going into the Civil War, we don't have an incredibly encouraging backdrop for the experience that Civil War soldiers are about to undergo. So during the war, let's start with what first comes to mind, I think, for a lot of folks when talking about mental health and mental well-being in a war zone, and that is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. While the Civil War saw many frightening images, this among the most stark and intimidating, the Civil War saw over 750,000 deaths. So it's nearly inevitable that hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers would have suffered from some trauma-related mental condition. And I'll note here, and I'm going to go on at length about how they don't really have language at the time of the Civil War for what we know today as PTSD. And that makes it tricky not only to research things like this, because you need to try and figure out not only the language of the time, but what the language of the time might refer to, but what Civil War scholars increasingly have used to refer to this. They refer to the experience that many soldiers undergo as simply war trauma. So I'll use that term throughout the program here. So unfortunately, not only did they not have the language, neither did they have the understanding of this condition, nor really the ability to treat those who suffered from it. Images like this became at least somewhat commonplace in Civil War armies. This is a wartime sketch entitled Played Out. And again, we can't guarantee, say with certainty what this soldier might have been going through, or really either of the soldiers depicted there. But this is an image that gets brought up with some frequency when talking about this topic, because they certainly look like they've been through some things. The Civil War, of course, had no name for PTSD, but if they had no word for traumatic experience, they certainly knew what exhaustion and strain were. When Surgeon John Perry wrote in June of 1864 that, quote, "I am heartsick over it all," we might take heartsick to mean more than merely weary or fed up. Despite the hard demeanor of soldiers and surgeons, they could not help reflecting on what they had experienced. We can be sure that North Carolina surgeon Thomas Wood was not the only one of whom it could be said that the scenes he witnessed must have haunted his dreams for the rest of his life. Myron Robinson, a surgeon of the 6th Connecticut Regiment, followed his regiment into the attack on Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863, the assault dramatized in the movie Glory, involving the 54th Massachusetts, in addition to the Myron Robinson 6th Connecticut. Myron Robinson suffered from nightmares of, quote, our bloody horrible night, up to and probably beyond the war's end. Later that same year, he described how he continued to feel, quote, a sense of forlorn depression set in upon me, in which my mind could not shut off the recounting of that tragic night. When he did sleep, in his dreams, he could, quote, still feel the frustration when we could not stop the bleeding. Only as the war ended did he feel that, quote, the terrors of war begin to fade from me and my dreams. But even after the war, thunderstorms brought back uncomfortable memories, and he felt highly emotional when he became the head of a soldier's home in Connecticut. So if we can agree that Civil War combatants suffered from war trauma, what words and diagnoses did they use? Well, one term that came up often were homesickness and nostalgia. Terms that the symptoms which they exhibited we might associate with something like PTSD, though it's worth noting that reverse diagnosis is always tricky and certainly not always advisable, given again this sort of language barrier, if you will. I can't underscore that enough. Surgeons defined homesickness as a temporary feeling of depression and an intense longing for the comforts of home. Nostalgia was closely related, but it was sort of an advanced form of homesickness, and it was thought that that could be deadly, especially when paired with a more traditional physical illness. Homesickness and nostalgia seem to pervade more in winter quarters or when not on active campaign. The thinking being that when soldiers had more downtime, their minds could wander to home, making them sad they were deprived of the home's comforts. To treat this, surgeons were hesitant to send patients home for fear of everybody in the ranks suddenly coming down with homesickness. Instead, physical activity was their preferred treatment plan, and there you see a group of Civil War soldiers playing a rousing game of football. While we don't have any recorded cases of homesickness during the Civil War in the medical and surgical history, and that is, at least for our museum, one of our greatest resources, and this is all available for free publicly online. If you just Google the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, you can read all 6 parts of it. Each part's 1,000+ pages. Probably put you right to sleep, but the information in there is really excellent. In there, they make reference to homesickness, but they don't tabulate statistics the same way they do for, say, typhoid fever or gangrene in there. And not entirely sure why they decided not to recount this. Perhaps they felt it not serious enough to record, since they did not deem the disease deadly in ways they did nostalgia, or perhaps they had so little understanding of exactly what it was they were encountering, they didn't record it for that reason. But we can assume that there were probably substantially more cases of homesickness than there were of nostalgia, which we do have records of, given that homesickness was the less intense version of nostalgia. Union surgeons reported 5,547 cases of nostalgia, and that number, the actual number of cases, probably substantially higher than that. Surgeons did not diagnose soldiers with these afflictions based on physical symptoms. Rather, they believed that these diseases were caused by poor weather, camp discomforts, idleness, and thus encouraged officers to improve camp conditions and provide open-air sports like football or baseball. Today, we believe that homesickness and nostalgia may have been terms certainly for depression, perhaps even post-traumatic stress disorder or some other forms of mental illness. And what follows are a couple different approaches that some Civil War surgeons advocated to deal with this, even beyond open-air sports like football and baseball. Beginning with Surgeon John L. Taylor of the 3rd Missouri Cavalry, a Union unit, he reported the method that he used, saying, quote, those who suffered from nostalgia were generally found lying in bed or sitting around the tents, making a great deal to do about their sufferings and the ills that were awaiting them. The patients were now required to exercise to the extent of their physical ability, At the same time, a system was inaugurated to impress them that their disease was a moral turpitude, that soldiers of courage, patriotism, and sense should be superior to the influences that brought about their condition, and that to speak of home as inseparably connected with their recovery and all that constituted happiness was petty and degenerating. The purpose in view was made known to the nurses, and every opportunity was taken to inflame the feelings of the patients by impressing them with the idea that their disease was looked upon with contempt, that gonorrhea and syphilis were not more detestable. This course excited resentment, passions were aroused, and a new life instilled, and the patients rapidly recovered. Within 2 years, not a single case of nostalgia has occurred. So this surgeon opted to arouse anger in the people in the hopes that these passions that might be aroused would sort of awaken them from their, at least as they would think of it, as a stupor of sorts. Not sure that's maybe best practice today, to put it mildly. Another author in the medical and surgical history recommended this treatment. In large commands, men can be picked out with special talents as vocalists, prestidigitators. That's your word of the day, means magicians. Prestidigitators, gymnasts, etc. And these should be organized as an army company and encouraged by official recognition and assistance in catering for the amusement of the troops. A camp kept well amused will be a healthy one, free at the least from all nostalgic influences, and the object to be gained as promotive of efficiency is worthy of a special effort. In large commands, an officer should be detailed as superintendent of public amusements, who should be manager of theatrical performances, races, competitive shooting, and prize competitions of all sorts. If active and enterprising, he would save many from the sick list and tide the command over the tedium of winter quarters with undiminished nerve force. What a provocative phrase, undiminished nerve force. At least this surgeon in particular had the idea that humans over the course of any given day naturally build up nervous energy, and that there was some requirement for a healthy outlet for it, or else it could lead or turn into homesickness or nostalgia. So these are some common diagnoses of the soldiers, but what about the surgeons? How did they cope, and what did they experience when grappling with scenes like this? Surgeons bore a burden as heavy as those who fought. After the costly and futile assault at Cold Harbor, Daniel Holt, surgeon of the 121st New York Infantry, confided to his diary that, quote, "The wounded, as they come to the rear, make a person feel sad. My hands and heart are full," he wrote. That seems to be as concise a description of the surgeon's predicament as we might find, having to treat wounded men with all their professional skill, but carrying the burden and responsibility evermore. Union General Carl Schurz gave an example of a surgeon who found the ordeal too much, and in the midst of operating at Gettysburg, put down his instruments, quote, exclaiming that this was too much for human endurance, hysterical tears streaming down his face. From the Confederate side, an anonymous Texan rebel surgeon recalled a young doctor who, quote, backed out, went back to his old Kentucky home, couldn't stand it, too sanguinary for him. What kept these men going, both the surgeons and the soldiers? One answer is that humans can come to regard almost anything as ordinary given enough time. Confederate surgeon Edward Craighill mused in his memoirs that human beings never know the limit of their endurance until the test comes. The anonymous rebel surgeon simply observed that after the bloody battle of Perryville, quote, by and by, I got sorter used to it. Men on both sides accepted standards of manly endurance and accepted the notion of cowardice as almost a physical presence. William Child, surgeon of the 5th New Hampshire, who after Antietam and Fredericksburg had written to his wife Carrie, with groaning men all about me, confided that, quote, 3 days at Antietam and 1 night at Fredericksburg had given me enough of battle. But he felt he could not say so openly that, quote, some might say I was a coward to talk so. Like many, both soldiers and surgeons, they continued on for fear of what others might think of them. One big question for 19th century doctors was to figure out, with mental illness, was to figure out if it was structural / organic, terms they use sort of interchangeably, which is to say it had a physical effect on the body and it could be observed in something like a dissection or some other scientifically measurable way. Or if it wasn't that, perhaps it was then functional or purely psychic and exclusively impacting the mind. This was sort of the binary that many doctors of the 19th century approached mental illness with. Civil War surgeons made a few small attempts to link physical illness with mental illness, as surgeon J.C. Norton wrote, saying that, quote, "I'm aware that when a disease becomes popular, there are many soldiers who will take advantage of it and feign the symptoms to avoid duty. At the same time, my observation has taught me that there is not 1/2 as much malingering in the army as is generally supposed. That mental influences have much to do with the production of disease, there can be no doubt." And he decided not to go on and elaborate that very provocative last sentence there. In steps Dr. Jacob Mendes da Costa, who you see pictured there on the screen. And he sits at the cutting edge of Civil War medical research. The Civil War brings about the birth of medical specializations, where before there was general medicine. Following the Civil War, we have fields of reconstructive surgery, neurology, cardiology, and Dr. da Costa is, like I said, on the forefront of this. And he does a lot of research into a disease that he terms irritable heart syndrome. Dr. da Costa examined 300 cases of cardiac muscular exhaustion. Cases of this kind were to be sent to his wards in Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia. Dr. da Costa associated what he grew to call irritable heart with, quote, hard service, which included anything from long drill sessions to active combat. Such hard service, he decided, led to physical symptoms, including fluttering cardiac action, an accelerated pulse, and unpleasant dreams. Dr. da Costa's research was only preliminary, again, only 300 patients. More research would have to come after the war ended. His treatment for irritable heart involved digitalis, or dried leaves of foxglove, used to slow the heart rate, and what is still used in heart medications today. So treating the symptoms and not really getting too much further beyond that to try and link the physical manifestations of the hard service that he observed and anything that might be impacting the mind. Sadly, one of the things that we have to talk about, certainly in this conversation, has to do with suicide. Horace Porter, a Connecticut regimental surgeon, spoke at the Northern Kansas Medical Society after the war, saying that, quote, "For every 1 hour of battle, there were hundreds of hours of brain tension and expected danger." The Union Army reported 826 suicides among active duty soldiers from July of 1861 to June of 1866. This number does not include Civil War veterans who committed suicide long after the war concluded, possibly as a result of lingering war trauma. While we lack the data to quantify suicide among Civil War veterans, we can draw on contemporary research of veterans, of modern wars that provide context for 19th century veterans. We know, for example, that 20% of Vietnam veterans made suicidal attempts, and another 20% at some point were preoccupied with suicidal thoughts. Eric T. Dean's path-breaking study, Shook Over Hell, where he compares PTSD in Vietnam veterans and Civil War veterans, found that in his research, over half of the residents of an Indiana Civil War veterans home either attempted or contemplated suicide. These men in the Civil War era rarely left behind suicide notes explaining why they took their own lives. And the scarcity of the notes certainly leaves more questions than answers, but it may reveal how deeply traumatized these men were as they found themselves unable to put into words their emotional suffering. Sergeant Joseph Taylor of Florida, to use one example, was in his 30s when injured at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863. He was not discharged, but he was later released from the Army of Tennessee and became a sheriff in Jefferson County. A few months later, he shot himself through the heart while, quote, laboring under mental derangement. Mental derangement, I bring up very intentionally here, that was a common explanation for Civil War soldier / veteran suicide. It suggests a deviation from the normal and that there was no rational explanation for their actions. It was a term that sadly prevented further inquiry into the links between war trauma and mental illness and did not inspire a lot of further comment and research in that regard. Now I want to talk a little bit about long-term care facilities that existed for mentally ill patients during and after the war. I want to start by talking about St. Elizabeth's, which you see pictured there. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., originally known as the Government Hospital for the Insane, was one of the most well-known facilities of the period. It was established through the Civil Diplomatic Appropriation Act of 1852 and admitted its first patients in 1855. Dorothea Dix, our old friend, its founder and leading mental health reformer of the 19th century, inspired the law that articulated the hospital's mission to, quote, provide the most humane care and enlightened curative treatment of the insane of the Army, Navy, and the District of Columbia. Located on a hill in southeast Washington, D.C., overlooking the Anacostia and Potomac rivers, it offered a panoramic view of the city. St. Elizabeth's was built as a 250-bed hospital, and Thomas Walter, the architect of the Capitol building, drafted the architectural plans for the center building, and it had 3 different wings, the west, east, and center wings, and they each became distinct hospitals and headed by a different physician. During the Civil War, of course, it had to divert its resources from its main purpose as a mental hospital to be used as a general hospital. On October 10, 1861, in the early days of the Civil War, the U.S. Congress authorized temporary use of the unfinished East Wing as a 250-bed general hospital for long-term care for sick and wounded soldiers from the Union Army. The West Lodge for African American men was converted into a 60-bed general and quarantine hospital for the sailors from the Potomac and Chesapeake fleets. In 1862, an artificial limb manufacturing shop was set up to fit amputees with artificial limbs. Amputees from neighboring hospitals were transferred to St. Elizabeth's to fit the prostheses free of charge. Soldiers stayed at the hospital until their wounds healed, and they learned to use their artificial limbs. During this period, a portion of the hospital's farm was converted into a cavalry depot and an encampment for a marine company, so drifting quite far from the original mission of serving as a mental hospital. During the Civil War, the wounded soldiers were reluctant to write home that they were being treated at the Government Hospital for the Insane. They began referring to the asylum as St. Elizabeth's Hospital after the colonial name that the tract of land where the hospital was located, and Congress finally changed the hospital's name to St. Elizabeth's in 1916. St. Elizabeth's was the first and only federal mental health facility in the United States at that time. Soldiers were referred there for treatment after they were thoroughly evaluated for malingering or deception. The way for a Union soldier to get discharged from the Army based on mental disability, say for nostalgia or other things, was through St. Elizabeth's. The admission and discharges were controlled and authorized by the Adjutant General's office. After the war, the Army and Navy general hospitals were closed. The artificial limb manufacturing shop was dismantled, but the hospital finally got back to its mission, caring for mentally ill Civil War veterans. Following the war, of course, there is a swell of people who end up at St. Elizabeth's. And in 1866, Congress passed an act that permitted the St. Elizabeth's to admit all men who had served as Union soldiers in the Civil War and were found insane within 3 years of discharge by reasons of continuation of mental illness, relapses after recovery, or mental illness relating to military service. The hospital gradually received veterans from all parts of the United States, and many of these former soldiers were chronically ill and required custodial care. To relieve congestion and overcrowding, the hospital continued to construct new buildings. in 1871, 72, 78, 1880, 1882, 1887, 1898, and 1899. So it expanded as the need grew more and more the older some of these Civil War veterans grew. St. Elizabeth's Hospital has 2 cemeteries where soldiers from the Civil War are interred. Civil War Cemetery on the west side of the grounds has approximately 500 graves featuring white and African American soldiers from the Union Army and some soldiers from the Confederacy as well. And St. Elizabeth's still functions today as a psychiatric facility. But what was the experience of veterans in places like St. Elizabeth's? Not just here, but there were places like this all around the country at the state level. Many inmates of mental institutions were eager to get out for fear that their time there might leave a lifelong stain on their character, as they described it. They desired to get back to work so they could rebuild their manhood or masculinity through earning what they saw as an honest living, working with their hands. Inmates, though, were hesitant to trust their own minds. They were there in a mental facility after all. They often tried to balance their desire to get out with their trust in the competence of the doctors, and thus the patients sometimes weren't sure if they could trust themselves to re-enter society safely, even though they desperately wanted to go there. Despite some of the horror stories that come out of asylum life in this period, there were some happy endings. Some people, after fairly limited stints therein, or sometimes prolonged, managed to be released and wound up leading fairly typical lives. This highlights the fact that Civil War combat trauma did not fit strict categories of sanity and insanity. Trauma sometimes could just be one element of a veteran's life rather than its defining element. The mental illness of Civil War veterans impacted families as well, no surprise, often and especially the wives of the soldiers in question. They would frequently have to either take on the role of caretaker for both the children and sometimes the newly dependent husband, while also earning a living to support the family at large. In letters to loved ones at asylums, family members grappled with the nature of their beloved's disability. They tried to come to terms with an impairment that lacked clear causation or outward signs, yet was severe enough to merit commitment. Family members often expressed confused grief for a man that in many ways no longer existed, and they attempted to reconcile their memory of that man with the reality of the one now living at the institution. To quote from Sarah Handley Cousin's recent book, Bodies in Blue, about disability among Union Civil War veterans, of this phenomenon, she wrote that in the testimonies of asylum residents and their families, quote, "These individuals almost always centered the war as the agent of change. A soldier left for the war as one man and came back as another. More importantly, soldiers and their loved ones described how that change set off chain reactions in their lives, altered their plans for the future, and upended domestic harmony. But what seemed to pain many families most was the idea that mentally disabled soldiers were gone from their lives, but not from this life. They were trapped far from home, living in a state somewhere between this world and the next. If some physically disabled veterans occupied a liminal state between hero and pauper, the mentally disabled occupied one between living and dead. The vacant chair remained empty, but so too did the grave." And so this was a challenging experience, not just obviously for the people who experienced this, but for the families at home. And while we're on the subject of families, let's talk a bit about the civilian impact that mental illness in this period could have. And the Civil War took a mental toll on the people on the home front as well. The war forced thousands from their homes and caused intense anxiety with loved ones in combat zones. Mary Jeffries Bethel described on April 17, 1862, the anxiety of waiting to hear about her sons. Quote, "I feel very anxious to hear from the battle to know if my boys are hurt. This suspense and anxiety of mind is very unpleasant." Economic devastation from the war made life difficult for families and put further mental stress on them. whether it was having the primary breadwinner out of the house or even killed, or having armies traipse through their property and destroying crops, as with the Pry family that you see here. That's Philip and Elizabeth Pry, one of our 3 locations. The Union Army encamped on their property. Their crops are ruined, livestock killed, their barn occupied and left in great disrepair by the Union Army who used it as a field hospital. They submit for thousands of dollars of damage claims after the war. They get a little bit back, not nearly enough, and eventually in the early 1870s they end up moving to Tennessee in an effort just to get a fresh start. One day in September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam devastated the fortunes of one family, and they were far from the only one to have that experience. People in combat zones all across the nation, and those, like I mentioned earlier, who lost loved ones. The Civil War was an economic toll that they never really could recover from. But there are some heartwarming stories on the civilian side, and those, at least the one I'm about to tell, comes to us via the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office. Clara Barton, in the waning days of the Civil War, her job as a Civil War nurse is a little bit less necessary, and she approaches Abraham Lincoln, the federal government. This is the age before dog tags, personal identification. If you're from, say, New Hampshire and you fall on a battlefield in Virginia, there's no specific way that your family might know what happened to you. And so Clara Barton, with the blessing of Abraham Lincoln and later Congress, creates the first government-sponsored attempt to search for missing soldiers, bringing an incredible sense of closure and clarity and economic security to people. Knowing that a loved one is deceased enables them to file for a pension, where the lack of certainty about the fate of a loved one or a soldier would close the door on a pension, at least for a time. So from 1865 to 1868, Clara Barton circulates 5 of these, what are, she labels rolls of missing men, circulated in newspapers around the country. Soldiers' names are separated out by states, saying, you know, if you know anything about these people, please write to me. And, you know, sort of an early crowdsourcing project in many ways. But Clara Barton, over the course of those 3 years, her and a very small team exchange about 60,000 letters with people around the country. And Clara Barton and company find the final resting place of about 22,000 missing soldiers, a Herculean achievement for which she's not given as much credit as some of her other activities. Clara Barton saw her mission as providing comfort. What she wrote to one person that wrote into her, she replied saying that, quote, "If it has been my privilege to lighten ever so little the heavy burden of grief which has been laid upon the hearts of our suffering people, or throw the feeble weight of my arm on the side of my country in her hour of trial, I have made and if I have made one heart stronger or one war less bitter, I regard it as a blessing forever beyond my power to express. And whatever yet remains to be done, or however weary I may become, even in well-doing, my soul will always be lifted up, my hands strengthened, my step quickened, and the miles shortened by the reflection that the hearts of good men and women are with me in my work, that I carry their respect and approval, and their generous consideration is helping me on to its accomplishment." Clara Barton could get carried away sometimes with some of her statements, which is why she made such a good speaker after the war, and why you should always take what she says with a grain of salt. Clara Barton, an incredible person, but she did like to carry on sometimes. All that said, the Missing Soldiers Office did an incredible work bringing some degree of closure to families after the war. Now, what about after the war? Suffering is both individual and social. The mental suffering of Civil War soldiers, as we've explored, impacted their families who didn't know much about how to care for them, much less understand what exactly made them that way in the first place. In lieu of their biological families, veterans frequently turned to their former comrades in arms, as you can see pictured here. A coping mechanism they began to develop during the war itself. During the war, as historian Jim Broomall argues in his book on the emotional lives of Southern men, soldiers developed what he calls emotional communities, which provided a family while they were away from home. As Dr. Broomall writes, quote, Job Smith related to his friend Cadwallader Wad Jones, two really incredible Civil War names, Job Smith and Cadwallader Wad Jones. Job Smith related to his friend his haunting returns to the battlefield. Sometimes in my sleep, he wrote, my mind wanders to the sad battlefield, lying down in the line and thin as a chip, half frightened out of my wits, expecting any moment the command of forward. Smith's night terrors are similar to those experienced by another Confederate who recorded that while in the Army, I've had great and exciting times at night with my dreams since the battle. Some of them are tragedies and frighten me more than ever the fight did when I was wide awake. Smith now took great solace in sharing these feelings through letters or receiving letters from friends. Together, he imagined, they could cheer each other in life and find peace during a period of degradation and trouble. Wartime experiences and battlefield horrors left these men exposed and frightened, emotions they shared with friends who underwent similar ordeals. And I'll note, too, that they didn't share these as often with their families because and here we get to what I've briefly alluded to before, the language barrier. There's no way to adequately describe this to people who have not experienced it as well. Smith became part of an ever-expanding group of men who looked to other veterans for comfort, demonstrating that the bonds formed in camp and on campaign had forged lasting friendships. By the same token, veterans organizations, more formal ones in this case, played a notable but largely unrecognized role in mental health after the war. The GAR, or Grand Army of the Republic, a Union veterans organization, you can see a gathering of them here, and United Confederate Veterans organization, gathered at encampments and reunions and had regular meetings all around the country. And they got together on battlefields, on battle anniversaries, and in regular weekly or monthly meetings in their local communities, and getting together regularly with these people who, again, could concretely understand some of the experiences that these soldiers went through, whether they were aware of it or not, provided, I would have to imagine, some form of light therapy, which was not insignificant, I think. Individuals, outside of the group dynamic, had their own coping mechanisms. The anonymous rebel surgeon from Texas explained 30 years after that when remembering his wartime service, quote, before I was aware of it, there had come trooping before my mental vision a whole lot of unpleasant recollections. His remedy for what he called the blues was to seek distraction in Mark Twain or other humorous writings. Others found rituals to permit them to remember more safely. Henry Janes, who became responsible for Union hospitals after Gettysburg, allowed himself to remember only and exclusively each July when he would sit and leaf through his casebook. Others didn't respond so healthily. The alcoholic or opium-eating veteran became a ubiquitous stereotype in the post-war years for a reason. Many veterans, perhaps suffering from lingering effects of war trauma, turned to alcohol or opium as a coping mechanism. Addiction was seen as a moral failing in the 19th century and not as a symptom of any mental issues or anything else. Thus, veterans who struggled with it had few resources to help them out, as they were, in this instance, seemed to be socially deviant. Ironically enough, alcoholism was seen as a disqualification to serve in the Army, but you could not be discharged from the Army for repeated drunkenness. So this was in some ways cultivated during the Civil War itself. In the post-war years, soldiers' homes, veterans' homes, tried to establish their own bars to reduce the instances of veterans going to shops in town and disrupting the local community, and those efforts met with limited success at best. Many surgeons thought that alcoholism gave rise to mental illness as opposed to the other way around. As Hosea Rude, a veteran who visited the Milwaukee Soldiers' Home, wrote, that the veteran residents there were, quote, a drunken lot of old fellows. It is a sad sight. This degradation of the souls of these old men is worse than the shooting of their bodies in war. Again, tells you what people thought about addiction back then. The other intense form of addiction was opium eating. The Union Army alone, and again, this gets to the ways that this addiction was sort of cultivated in the service, the Union Army alone gave out 10 million doses of opium to its soldiers, so it's no wonder that many became addicted after the war. This cartoon depicts here, of course, the prevalence of opium and drugs of all sorts in the Gilded Age America in the 1880s and such. You could go down to your local CVS, or the equivalent of CVS, and just get some opium over the counter, basically however much you wanted, and many other things besides. So given the prevalence of opium in American society, it probably is no surprise that there came a nationwide opium addiction crisis after the war. The Civil War and the amount of opium distributed to Civil War soldiers accelerates this addiction crisis, and Civil War surgeons, as time goes on, feel increasingly guilty about the role that they played in it as they start to kind of put two and two together. And eventually their solution is to make opium harder to access, stop prescribing it as liberally, and so on. So as we draw to a close here, I want to conclude with a brief snippet of conversation I had when I interviewed Dr. Dylan Carroll, who wrote the recent book, Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness, and Civil War Soldiers, on one of our live stream programs. And we do regular video programming through the museum, both on our Facebook page, YouTube channel, and now most recently on Instagram and TikTok, so you can find us wherever you get your social media. But I was having a conversation with Dr. Dylan Carroll on one of our programs, and I'd encourage you to go look that up if you found this at all engaging today. He noted that when comparing the care for the mentally ill of the Civil War era and the mentally ill of the present, not nearly as much has changed as perhaps it should have. And while that is sort of a depressing note to end on, I would rather leave you with sort of a call to action. Let us take that as inspiration to do what we can to address and give, volunteer, and assist with mental health advocates today, mental health reformers, and people in your local community. And of course, as we've talked about, Sykesville has a long history with that. Whether those efforts be for the benefit of veterans or the general public, and the hope is that a rising tide will lift all. So I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note and sort of a call to action. So thank you so much for listening tonight, and I look forward to questions and some good conversation afterwards. So thank you so much. Any questions? Yes?
I do. You mentioned the call to action. It appears to me, and I am not a healthcare professional, that the deinstitutionalization of the 70s and 80s pushed a lot of people out of hospitals onto the street. And I've heard from at least our police department that that's a problem for them, that they have a blunt instrument with a delicate issue. They arrive, someone's waving a machete at them. They don't have time to do psychoanalysis. They're by necessity more likely to have to end this quickly. Am I mistaken that deinstitutionalization of the 80s was wrong and should be reversed in the upcoming decades?
That's a great question, and one that I, as a historian, am certainly not qualified to answer. So my area of knowledge basically ends pretty abruptly circa 1900. So I wish I could speak more to it. I'm not an expert, and I'll defer to anyone else in the room, but I can't speak to that. Yeah, please.
But since this is mostly about Civil War, I will try to stick to that. Yeah.
So I've looked at mustering out papers before from the Civil War era, and there's all kinds of reasons why they seen anything that was mentally registered. You know, it's almost like, I didn't even see the word melancholia. Everyone was sad,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. You know, so have you done research on that to see those mustering rolls to see if any sign of mental illness was the cause for them leaving?
I haven't looked extensively at them. I've looked at a little bit. But my guess is that it would be in the minority. It would heavily be physical related illnesses, certainly amputations and really debilitating diseases and such.
Sure.
But in the medical and surgical history, which is just this very intensive tabulation of Civil War diseases, conditions, basically anything that Civil War doctors are doing, they're sort of more or less writing it down, which is why it's such a great resource. But the extent to which they talk about mental illness at all is homesickness, nostalgia, and irritable heart. And combined, we're looking at, say 6,000 cases, and, many of them are not discharged ultimately. So the only folks that are being discharged, for specifically and exclusively for any sort of mental related trauma are going through St. Elizabeth's. That's not a huge facility. We're talking, several hundred beds. So my best guess is that it would be a small number. But it has to have happened. I mean, in a conflict as massive as the Civil War, basically everything's happened once. So I'm certain it happened, but my suspicion is that it's quite rare. Any other questions? Yeah.
How did it affect the medical school?
You mean like what the curriculum?
Like, did they change the Civil War 4 years?
Oh, sure.
Things happened tremendous the whole country. Did the medical schools get involved, or did they have?
So they contributed students to both armies. And what better on-the-job learning can you possibly have than, sort of you ideally don't want to be too close to the front, but, before the Civil War, dissection was sort of seen as taboo. To be raised up at the end of times, it was thought you needed a physically intact body, and to dissect someone is sort of to commit them to a second death almost. And for that reason, judges would sometimes, on top of capital punishment, give as a sentence dissection after the execution. So there's not a lot of experience amongst people in medical schools of like seeing the interior of a human body. It doesn't happen a whole lot. Suddenly, it's everywhere in the Civil War, whether you want to see the interior or not. And so because of that, it's an incredible learning opportunity, and the surgeons of both sides attempt to brand it as such. Civil War surgeons are seen as, surgeons, doctors in general are seen as kind of, shady people, distrustful. They're the creepy people that cut people out behind closed doors. We don't like them. But the Civil War is very much almost sort of a PR campaign, to, get people to realize the benefits that might come from all the, doing all these procedures. Civil War surgeons become amongst the most skilled surgeons in the world. And so medical schools send cadets to join the Army, get on-the-job training. It's sort of the best practicum you can possibly imagine. After the war, like I said, we get the development of medical specialization, and for the first time in American history, as a direct result of the Civil War, the United States goes from exclusively a consumer of medical knowledge to now we're producers of medical knowledge. So it's the Civil War is a massive turning point in medicine in this country as a whole.
Do you think the rate, and I know it's hard to do an analysis this far forward, and even given the fact that, as you said, some doctors in the Civil War tended to view this as a moral failing rather than a medical issue, which it is. Do you think that the rates of PTSD and of melancholy and of homesickness, whatever you want to call it, were comparable to future and past wars, or do you think it spiked since it was on home territory? Do you think the technology of killing affected it? I'm trying to gauge in the Civil War, was it about the same?
Sure, sure. Well, a great place if you want more information than I'm going to be able to provide here is Eric Dean's Shook Over Hell, where he explicitly does that. He compares Civil War veterans who suffer from war trauma and Vietnam veterans. It's explicitly a comparative study to try and get to the root of your exact question. Shook Over Hell is what it's called, and the author is Eric Dean. It's a really pretty incredible book. With the caveat, of course, that it's hard to say. One of the things that he talks about in there is that, there's some people have advanced theories on sort of either side of that, the horrific killing machines of World War I, that, the higher rate of death that appears in that war than, say, the Civil War, if that somehow led to more trauma. But at the end of the day, basically, as best as he could suss out, just being in a combat zone, no matter what, I mean, your life is sort of at risk, and those of people that you care deeply about, that's an intensely challenging situation. And I had a conversation too with another author, Evan Kutzler. He wrote a book called Living by Inches, the sensory experience of living in a Civil War prison. And a question I asked him was like, was there a Civil War prison that was especially bad? Was there a range? And basically said that living in any Civil War prison is one of the worst things you could ever undergo in life. And I think you could apply something very similar to the experience of being in combat, having your life be able to be taken away at a moment's notice, or the lives of those you care about. No matter how deadly or not, or whatever the weaponry is, I think it is the human body and mind. I think can only probably take so much, and the level of tolerance maybe can change from individual to individual, but I don't think it's as dramatically different as we might think. So my extremely amateurish guess, I wouldn't imagine it would be incredibly different war to war. That's my best guess.
I don't know specifically about military-related instances of insanity or in melancholia or those sorts of things, but nationally speaking, they had been doing censuses of institutions of mental health care as early as the 1830s and 40s. And just in the general populace, the proportion of individuals with mental health care needs had blown up in between when they started doing them and through the Civil War. And then you see this huge rise at the start of the Civil War. And it does continue to rise from there. You never see it as large a spike. And I think a lot of it is, as we were talking about earlier, the idea of the specialization of different diseases and realizing, okay, this is something completely different.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
So, how good were they at distinguishing the difference between, how can I put it? The difference between a physical ailment and a psychological ailment, and I'll add a chemical dependency.
Mm-hmm. They weren't very good at that. They're a Civil War surgeon. If someone comes to them, their first thought will be every single time there's something physically wrong with this person. Now they had, a couple tools in the toolbox to maybe diagnose someone with sort of mental, with a mental condition, but not a lot. And you can see, there are quite literally hundreds of thousands of cases in the medical and surgical history, and only 5,000 diagnoses of nostalgia and 300 of irritable heart. And those are sort of the closest approximation for some sort of mental condition that are out there. So they're skewing heavily towards the physical side because that's what they know. And so, yeah, for that reason, I would say they're not particularly adept. And one thing that I think, mercifully has changed over time is we're, at the very least, at the bare minimum, we're sort of much more well-equipped with verbiage, language, and some ideas about diagnoses. So that is one notable way that we have changed. since then.
No?
One question I have is, during the Civil War, mental illness, I guess, homesickness or melancholy or what have you, was seen as kind of a moral failing, or a character weakness.
Sure.
But I'm wondering, as these veterans, were suffering from PTSD and from substance use disorders in the decades after the war, if that stigma around their weakness or failing loosened up a little bit, among society at large.
It's a good question, and one that sort of is the subject of ongoing research. They come back, so the prevailing societal ideas are exactly what you just said, and even on top of that, even just missing a limb is sort of not thought of as a moral failing, but you're in some ways less of a person in the eyes of society. But the society is also having to reckon with, well, wait, but these people coming home missing limbs are also heroes, but they're less of a person. So there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that goes on with all of this, and there is sort of a reckoning that kind of plays out, and the veterans organizations become huge voting blocs, and so suddenly their interests are notable, and so people start really paying attention to what they have to say, and of course they fought for the national defense and all that sort of thing. So there is definitely a reckoning. I mean, it's certainly not like a switch gets flipped. It's a gradual thing, and certainly by say 1900, there hasn't been a societal revolution where it's like, oh, I can't believe how ignorant we were in 1865 when these people first came home. But there is some changing that happens, but I think the degree to which that change takes place is sort of an ongoing source of discussion, and a great resource about that, again, if you're curious for a much longer thing, is Sarah Handley Cousins' Bodies in Blue, where she studies disabled Civil War veterans. And that's not her primary concern in that book, but it is one of the concerns that she touches on in there. So that's a good resource in that regard.
I think the biggest thing that we see is different in the records that we have at the museum is that it becomes less associated with poverty. So prior to the Civil War, you have all these individuals in almshouses and poorhouses and these asylums that are really awful prior to Dorothea Dix. And once the Civil War comes and you have this mass population who all of a sudden, these are the war heroes who have these same problems, it's very much elevated. And that's one of the things driving the force between in the 1880s, when a lot of institutions like Springfield became established, that you see the money going to those because they recognize that it's not good enough and something needs to be done for the broader population that has these problems too.
Yeah, there's a reason why not just Springfield came into being, but St. Elizabeth kept expanding, and absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
If a soldier went to war, okay, and they cut an arm off or a limb off or something like this, when they come back from the war, if possible, wouldn't they be even more determined to be self-sufficient and not ask for help and figure out a way to do it themselves?
There is a huge drive for that, an absolutely huge drive for that. But in the event that they physically cannot, the pension system explodes, not unlike the series of mental institutions that they come up. But you're absolutely right. I mean, those that are in a place like St. Elizabeth are desperate to get out and do exactly what you just said. And those without limbs are eager to go it alone. And so that's why these, what Jim Broomall terms emotional communities, are sort of a big deal. They're very uncomfortable with going to sometimes even their own families for help, but certainly society at large. And so more often than not, if a Civil War veteran turns to somebody, it's another Civil War veteran. And you're exactly right.
it wouldn't be the reason that they come back to their, other people who fought in the same war, is because the people who fought in that war are the only people who really understand what happened.
Mm-hmm.
If you weren't in the war, you don't understand. Well, you can give your sympathy and all that, but you don't, if you haven't lived the same thing, you don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, just want to kind of follow up to my previous question and to his observations. The generation following World War I is known as the lost generation because of the trauma that they endured from that very horrific war.
Sure.
And I think when we think about the stigma or thinking around PTSD, I mean, it seemed like after World War I they were calling it shell shock. They were calling it PTSD at that point. But it seemed like there was much more sympathy for those who were suffering from it than only 60 years prior.
Sure. And I'm not as much of an expert on that, but from what I know, and actually you might be able to speak more to that, perhaps not. But yeah, that's my impression, is that you're right, yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you for coming out tonight,
Absolutely.
and we will see you again sometime soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah, thanks for coming, and great questions, everybody.